Welcome back to the 1662 Fellowship of North America. I'm Isaac Rayberg, the rector of All Saints Anglican Church in San Antonio, Texas, and the Archdeacon for Liturgy in the Anglican Diocese of All Nations. Here at the 1662 Fellowship, we promote the classical formularies of the Anglican tradition as the theological center of gravity for North American Anglicanism. Today, we're going to resume our interview with the Most Reverend Peter Robinson, who is the Presiding Bishop of the United Episcopal Church in North America. And this week, we're going to be talking about that theological center of gravity. Bishop Robinson put together a wonderful list on a Facebook post of kind of how he sees the defining characteristics of the Anglican tradition. And it's a good example of how the formularies fall into that center of gravity and how this, frankly, sometimes contrasts with other approaches to the Anglican tradition. So we continue our interview. Which then brings us back to your 8 points. The four from the quadrilateral, the scriptures, creeds, two sacraments, Dominical Sacraments, historic episcopate, and then on top of that, you've got the 39 articles, the first four councils, the fathers of the first five, which, I mean, that's classic Lancelot Andrews, right? And then the liturgy. Interestingly, you have the list in two different places. One has the articles above the councils and fathers, one has it below them.
That's because I go back and forth on that point.
Yeah, I liked that because I do too.
I think it's because I tend to regard it as kind of a chicken and egg thing.
Mm-hmm.
The articles are an evangelical take on the teaching of the first four councils and the first 5 centuries of fathers. On the other hand, the articles become the mirror through which we view the first four councils and the first 5 centuries. That sort of chicken and egg relationship between the two. What I find is a real problem with modern Anglicanism is they tend to try and push beyond Lancelot Andrews's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
They want to have 7 councils instead of 4, for example. Yeah.
And then they start picking up odd bits of medieval commentary on the tradition, like the 7 sacraments instead of 2.
Yeah.
You get definitions of the nature of the real presence, which are more Fourth Lateran Council than anything else.
There sometimes seems to be an assumption that the tradition of the church really hadn't changed from the 3rd century up until just the Reformation in some circles. And so they say, well, if we look at the late medieval, that tells us what was being done. But that's just not true. That's just not the way it was.
Basically, what you have 2 big shifts in the Middle Ages. The first one is with the reintroduction of Aristotelianism into the West through the writings of Averroes. Western theology until then had been largely influenced by the Neoplatonism of St. Augustine and Boethius.
And that is still kind of the way most of the East retained their approach to theology, was through that
Neoplatonism. They're Neoplatonic.
Yeah.
So you get the shift, you get the enthusiasm for Aristotle around 1200.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Black Death has a huge psychological effect on Western Europe.
I think that's often forgotten by theologians. Like, historians always mention it, but historical theologians, we forget about that a lot of times.
Mm-hmm. And you sort of see it a little bit in the succession of well-known English teachers in the 14th century. You have Thomas Bradwardine just before the Black Death. He actually dies in the first wave of the plague in England as Archbishop of Canterbury. He is one of the last of the classical Augustinians. His tract on predestination was reprinted by Matthew Parker in the early 1570s. More or less as a case of, hey, some of the problems we're dealing with have only been around 200 years.
Yeah, yeah.
Brad Wardine is considered mainstream in the 1330s, the 1340s. Wycliffe, who is very much, at least in the early part of his career, in accord with Brad Wardine's views, eventually starts running into trouble with the official church because of the shift in popular teaching. Post-Black Death popular teaching is much more pessimistic, much more focused on what happened, purgatory.
Almost appeasing God through the saints and things like that, rather than going to God for comfort.
Because the obvious medieval reaction to an event like the Black Death is, this is a visitation from God to scourge us for our sins.
Yeah.
It's difficult, I think, to overestimate the psychological effects of the Black Death on late medieval teaching. Now, that isn't to say that medieval theology had not been going off the boil for a couple of hundred years before that.
Mm-hmm.
But the Black Death is a huge, huge shock. And anyone who, for example, tries to appeal to the 11th century against the 15th century, which essentially is what Jan Hus is doing,
mm-hmm.
stands a pretty good chance of ending up on top of a bonfire.
Right.
So, yeah, there is a shift in the late medieval period. And of course, then you've got to go back to the 8th, 9th century, where there's the controversies between this, for want of a better way of putting it, the spiritualist and the real literalist interpretations of the real presence.
And then that's about when you start to see the transubstantiation being codified.
The first chinks of the first signs of transubstantiation are probably 10th century.
Mm-hmm.
When Berengarius gets himself into trouble. But it doesn't. It takes about 250 years for the church to bring the boot down and say transubstantiation is the way to go. And then, of course, you get Thomas Aquinas trying to define it as in as spiritual a way as he can.
Aquinas. It's always interesting to me when folks appeal to Aquinas. In that he's often not saying, like, you could get to a more reformed approach from Aquinas. I mean, little bit of gymnastics, but not a whole lot.
Right. I mean, for instance, an awful lot of what Thomas Aquinas writes about predestination is reproduced by the Lutheran formulas.
Yeah, yeah.
So, which kind of points up the degree to which really medieval theology goes off the rails after about 1200.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Aquinas is the last flowering of the old tradition before you get into the problems thrown up by the nominalists and, all that stuff that eventually necessitates the Reformation.
And so a lot of our reformers are trying to go back to that older position, but as you said in one place, don't turn someone loose on the fathers without a roadmap. I've got the old Shaft volumes here, and it occurred to me it'll probably take me until my retirement to read through them. I mean, it's just and the Shaft volumes aren't all the fathers. Like there's so much more out there since that was originally published.
Mm-hmm.
And so and that's why confessional documents were such a big deal for the reformers.
Yeah. They were the roadmaps.
And so when folks want to talk about, say the seven councils, as well, since that was from the undivided church, why would we go back to four? Now there's some greater Western context in that anyway.
Yeah. Well, one of the problems is the Seventh Council was not officially accepted in the West until the 15th century.
Yeah. And we were dealing off of some bad documents, but also just some philosophical and theological differing approaches.
Yeah, there's a little bit of it's all Greek to me going on.
Yeah.
Quite literally in that case.
Yeah.
Right. Then, in all honesty, 5 and 6 are simply workings out of 1 to 4.
Right. It's more of a footnote than their own thing.
Yeah. So you can, if I remember correctly, the 2 books of homilies do quote from the first 6 councils.
Yeah. And I think the only mention of the 7th is in the homily against idolatry, and it is not mentioned in a good light.
Correct. Yes. So the 7th was first, it was late being accepted in the West. It was an almost automatic rejection for the Reformation because it had been accepted so late in the West.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have a situation, not so much in the 1520s, but the 1530s, where the reformers are trying to find what constitutes the core of Christian teaching. At what point do things begin to go off the rails? And in doing that, they tend to refer back to the period before there begins to be significant strife between East and West. And that really takes you back to, in all likelihood, really no later than Gregory the Great.
Yeah.
After Gregory the Great, Rome is trying to impose an ecclesiastical intermittently is trying to impose an ecclesiastical superiority to balance the political superiority of Constantinople.
And interestingly, we see the same thing happening in the Eastern Church between Constantinople and Moscow today.
Yeah. And I think the feeling the reformers got is the safe period is before 600.
I like that phrase, the safe period. That's when things are okay.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's a lot less. The unity of the church is a lot more obvious in those days.
Then the other thing that's an issue in that bit that is very much part of the old high church position is this insistence on the consensus patrum.
Mm-hmm.
You don't yank odd quotations from the fathers out of context. So what you'll often get in the older textbooks like Waterland is they will just keep stringing quotes together to prove that, the most reliable fathers all agreed on this point.
And the homilies even do that from time to time, where there'll just be, just like you said, stringing quotes together. Which is one of the things that I found that kind of led me in a more away from that kind of 1980s, 1990s style Episcopal approach to things, which is what I had been taught when I was younger, and then into that more properly old high church for myself approach is like, these guys, they do know their fathers. They're not just quote mining. They're not just starting with a point and trying to find someone to support them. We'll go ahead and stop there and pick up next time with a discussion on how some of the later tendencies in Anglican approach to history have been a little bit less faithful to what's actually true historically speaking, and how this then flows into a renewal of the center of gravity as we're approaching it. And again, this has been the 1662 Fellowship of North America, and I'm Isaac Rayberg. God bless.